Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Wednesday morning's seminar, our online version of our breakfast seminars. And today we are joined by Conor Ahern, who is going to be delivering the latest in his QS series, and that is around COVID-19. As always, I'm sure you'll have questions for Conor. If you could utilise the Q&A panel in the bottom toolbar there, and then Conor will get to address as many of those as possible at the end of his presentation. So in the meantime, I will hand over to Conor. Conor, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Julie. And good morning, everyone. You're all very welcome to the latest in the QS series. Where this morning we're going to be looking at COVID-19. And, specifically the issue around recovery of costs associated with COVID-19 events. So yeah, we're going to get going into this now. There's a bit on my profile. Yeah, just a bit of housekeeping. As Julie said, please use the Q&A box. It's very engaging. You actually learn a lot, through that. And look, we will answer all questions at the end. So please do use that. Just be aware as well, this is not legal advice. It's more for education purposes and also just to assist in overcoming any issues you may have surrounding costs associated with COVID that I imagine is very common at the moment. I mean, I'm seeing it a lot. So look, I hope you take some tips away in order to best deal with your own situation. Right. So the agenda for this morning, we're going to start with looking at notice. Then we'll move into variations. We'll spend a lot of time in variations actually, because I think it's a very worthwhile exercise to review the wording around the variations and also, in order to interpret it in a way that gives us a more favorable way of covering our costs. We'll look at loss and expense obviously as well. We'll look at adjudication, the position there, reminder of the courts as to how they treat people trying to basically not honour their obligations due to events associated with COVID-19. That's a case of Milchrist versus Waters, which we'll review. We're going to look at negotiation. That's just basically some tips that, if I was still at QS at the moment, how would I deal with it? So I'll just give you some advice there as well before we wrap things up in a conclusion. We'll also give a nod to future contracts as well, because that's actually very important now, because obviously COVID events are known about. They're very foreseeable, and we'll see how just some tips on how you should deal with COVID in any future contracts as well. Right, so we'll start with notice. So look, when I say notice, first of all, when you look at extension of time, we're obviously looking at I'm sure you're all aware now of the force majeure clause, which is drafted broadly in JCT and NEC contracts. Now, I mean, that's been the common interpretation that COVID-19 is actually a force majeure event. Now, there is actually no definition of what force majeure is in English law. So, we kind of wait and see if there's confirmation. We wait for confirmation to see is COVID-19 actually a force majeure event? Very important point, because at the moment, with the common interpretation as a force majeure, if it turns out not to be the case, then it's going to cause a lot of problems. Look, obviously you've got to check the contract for any conditions precedent for your notices. When I say that, I mean obviously your extension of time and dealing with your relevant events, but also notice conditions precedent in relation to any loss and expense or variation. So it definitely worthwhile. Look, I imagine like it should really be done at this stage anyway, that you give the notices to basically satisfy any conditions precedent in your contract. And I've just listed some items here that ought to be recorded. So you want to have given notice of the date when productivity on site was impacted due to COVID. Now, a lot of that, from what I've seen, productivity was affected prior to lockdown, which obviously now is quite some time ago. It was the 22nd of March. But productivity, if you look back on, records, and we'll deal with records in detail shortly, productivity was likely to have been impacted before that date. And it was likely to be even further impacted from the date of lockdown. If if the project shut down, then obviously you don't have any productivity. But a lot, as we know, a lot of construction sites were kept moving. But obviously productivity was likely to have been affected. So you want to be given the date when that started to occur. Obviously you give the record the date when we left site, and if you were off site, you should be. I'd imagine all sites are back now. So obviously, notice of the day you return to site. You just want to have that recorded as a matter of fact. And also, I just mentioned here, the site operating procedures as issued by the CLC. They've constantly been updated. We're now on version 5 since the 1st of July 2020. Now, a key change in the version 5 was the distancing. They reduced the 2 meters down to 1 meter. That's an important factor to bear in mind in relation to your productivity. So, obviously, again, just be mindful of these changes that are happening in the background, and just be aware of the procedures that we ought to be working to at present. Okay, so look, we're going to move into variations, and as I said, there's variations. I like to categorize the variation clauses actually, and these are the standard JCT worded variation clauses. So the first clause here that I've included is, again, it's just good to take out the variation clauses, read them again, become familiar with them, and obviously we try to, link any changes, any variations with the COVID-19 events, if they have had a genuine impact on the works. So the variation 1 here is the alteration or modification of the design, the quality, or the quantity of the works, including the addition, omission, or substitution of any work. Now, I put the works on the second line in bold there, and it's just a bit of a warning to, as to its interpretation, because, the works are the works that you are required to do under your contract. But that doesn't extend to all of the works. If you're a subcontractor, for example, you're carrying out the groundworks, not everything that's included on the site is part of your work. So it's a word of warning, because this is what happens. There was a narrow definition of the works that was found in the case of Strachan and Henshaw versus Stein in 1997. Now, in this case, the site facilities had to be moved a significant distance. It was up to about 500 meters, or so half a kilometer is a significant distance away. That became the new distance between the the site welfare and the site itself and the work phase. So there was reduced productivity due to the additional time it took to for site personnel to walk from the new location of the site welfare and the work phase, and the contractor brought a claim on that basis. Now, in that case, the works are defined as work to be done by the contractor under the contract, and the Court of Appeal found that this did not extend to the site facilities. So the contractor, the site welfare being moved was not part of his works, and therefore he was not entitled to any change that was made to the works on site which were not part of his actual contract works. So again, it's just a word of caution as to the interpretation, and also just give you, start giving you an impression of the hurdles that need to be overcome in order to recover, be entitled to a variation here. And final point here is that most standard forms are widely drafted now, but it serves as a reminder to check the detail. So do be mindful of the fact, that definition of the works is actually very important. It got analysed in detail in Strachan and Henshaw, and just be aware of it if it could potentially cause an issue to your current project. Most likely it may have been done through a schedule of amendments, so just be mindful of that fact. Okay. Right. So the next the next section, what I call category 2, is the imposition of an instruction of the architect contract administrator of any obligations or restrictions in regard to access to the site or use of any specific part of it, limitations of working space, limitations of working hours, or the execution or completion of the work in any specific order. Now that is the standard JCT variation clause at 5.2 of pretty much all JCT contracts. But two things here. The first one is an instruction. Now, I mean, things are very straightforward if you have in fact been given an instruction to stop the works, and it's to be treated as a regular instruction under the construction contract. I say that because most of the correspondence that I've seen, like a lot of it has said that this is not to be deemed as an instruction, because if you issue an instruction, you're obviously opening the door for variation, loss and expense, and extension of time, and obviously that's not a satisfactory position for the contractor, for the employer or a main contractor in a main contractor subcontractor relationship, because unless he's got an instruction himself and he's dropping it down the chain of contracts. But that's one thing. So that is going to become a really important point on the actual interpretation of what an instruction in fact is, because I know that there has been a lot of correspondence that has been very careful to say that this is not to be deemed as an instruction. Okay, so, and the second part of that is the imposition of any obligations or restrictions, which we'll move on to now. So obviously access to the site. I mean, if you're prevented from getting to site, then obviously you shouldn't. If the site is closed, then you won't have any labor on site. But thinking of elements like standing plant that may be on site. Now I know that a lot of plant hire companies have managed to suspend payments. It's not been the case throughout, but that has been the case on a lot of sites that I've been dealing with. But again, it's not to be taken as a general rule. It's just each contract will be decided individually. But obviously if you're prevented from accessing the site, then is that a variation? Again, you just have to link that back to your instruction and interpret as to what it says. I mean, if you don't have any labor, then you won't. I mean, if you won't have, will you have costs? Again, just one thing that's one element of this variation clause to be considered. Working space. Now, obviously, this is important given social distancing guidelines and the need for 1 to 2 meters between site operatives. So, I mean, this is this is definitely the imposition of a restriction, and this is where you're most likely to be able to prove a reduction in productivity, because if it's the case that pre-COVID, if you go back to those early March, kind of February, January this year, I mean, if you look at records of outputs that we had at that time and now compare them to outputs basically when social distancing guidelines have been implemented, then you should be able to see a difference in the outputs. I mean, and most likely a reduction. Now, it could be the case, and it's not. I mean, it's not the general rule again that all works have been negatively affected, and you got to be very careful with that. I mean, what you want to be doing at the moment is to be in a position to show that there has in fact been a reduction. if there's not, then it's a futile exercise going after COVID costs, because if they're not real, then it's just not going to help your case, and it's only going to serve to frustrate the other side. So that's a really important element, that restriction in terms of the limitation on working space. And I think if you have the records and you are able to prove that, that's one area that should be definitely considered at this point. And like I said, if it's a case that you haven't noticed any reduction in productivity, then there's no need to go after additional costs. But at least you've done the exercise, and you'll be able to show your superiors that it has been checked and you are aware of it, and there is no cost to be recovered here. Working hours now, working hours has been affected as well. Many sites are now working staggered shifts due to longer site opening hours. Some sites are now working until, I think it's 9 p.m. in the evening is the most common one that I've seen. So that is definitely a change again, but you probably need to link that back to the records to see if there has in fact been any reduction in outputs, because arguably you could actually be working more, like it could be the position that you are actually working more efficiently as well. So again, it's just one element of the variation clause that needs to be considered when you're proposing your narrative to justify why you should be entitled to additional costs as a result of COVID. Now, the final point on category 2 relates to the execution of works in any specific order. Now, this depends on the contract wording, because if the contract is silent as to the order of works, then if the employer's team issues an instruction to complete the works in a reasonable order, then this does not always amount to a variation. And this was discussed in the case of Neodocs versus Swinton. In that case, the engineer instructed the contractor to carry out work in a specific way. Now, the court held that the contractor would be entitled to a variation if the engineer's instructions amount to a breach of contract by the engineer or the employer. In this case, he found that the instruction and the new working method was in fact reasonable. The instructions amounted to a variation of or in addition to the contract works for which the contractor was entitled to an extra charge under the contract. But again, you see where the contract was silent and where the engineer or the employer proposes a reasonable alternative way of working, then that doesn't always amount to a variation either. So again, that comes back to the importance of the detail in relation to your proposed working method that was included in the contract at the time that the contract was agreed. Now, bear in mind that most contracts were not agreed. Arguably, COVID-19 was unforeseeable. So then, but if the contract is silent, then the proposed new method of working may be perfectly reasonable. If it is, then it's going to be difficult to qualify for a variation, as was the case in Neodocs versus Swinton. Okay, so the rules. If we can prove that, that there has been a change in productivity, then the rule is that where the execution of additional or substituted work is of similar character but different conditions and quantities, then a fair allowance must be made for the difference. So this, I've highlighted the different conditions because the different conditions are the conditions imposed as a result of COVID. So, your cause and effect is, cause is COVID, effect is the reduced outputs. And what most contracts say in one shape or form is that a fair allowance has to be made for the difference. So really, if just for example, if you were, say, tying rebar, and pre-COVID you were say each steel fixer was tying a ton of rebar a day. So and since COVID, he's been able to tie half a ton a day as an example. So the difference is that the different conditions have reduce the output, and a fair allowance has to be made for that difference of half a ton per day. Now, what's a fair allowance for that? You go back to your contract rate, and you'll have to split out the labor element, because if you think about it, it's only the labor that will have changed. I mean, your fixings won't have changed. The price of rebar, from what I've seen, hasn't changed. I mean, that that's a separate point. But I mean, I can't imagine. From what I've seen, it hasn't changed so far. But so what is the difference? The difference is the reduced productivity on labor. So you're going to have to basically analyze your bill rate, because you're still carrying out your contract works, but all you're looking for is a fair allowance on the different conditions. And if you look at that, that is where I think that you will have success in COVID costs. But again, it does go back to the fact that you do need the records to show that there has in fact been that reduced productivity. If you don't have that, then we're going to struggle. Again, so it's just another word of warning. It's just saying that you got to make a significant effort to prove this, because there's many hurdles to be overcome in order to recover any such costs. Now, moving on then to what is a fair allowance. Now, this was decided in the case of Henry Boot versus Alstom combined cycles, and a fair allowance was held to mean that this was a fair valuation. Generally means a valuation which will not give the contractor more than his actual costs reasonably and necessarily incurred, plus similar allowances for overheads and profit for anything more than would confer on him an additional margin for profit and would not be fair to the employer. So again, just take the example on the rebar. You are entitled to a fair amount of overheads and profit on that, as well as the increased cost of tying the rebar. So do bear that in mind when you are actually submitting costs, and take that into account. But do start with the bill of quants rates and an analysis of those. That's what the contract requires. Okay, records. So like I was saying, in relation to the productivity, what we want to do is, obviously we're going like the standard records that that need to be reviewed. That people say that we have these, but then when you go drilling down into the detail, the information is not sufficient to be able to prove a case one way or the other. So just like by your site team saying that, oh yeah, we do daily diaries. I mean, obviously you still have to check the content of the daily diaries to show that they are in fact picking up the key information that we're looking for in them, in order to be able to show any reduced outputs at a later date. So yeah, daily diaries is one. Obviously progress reports, very important. Drop line programs, again, because you should be able, we should be showing now, if there has been a drop in outputs, there is going to be time associated with that as well. So you are going to be looking for an extension of time, because on the other side of it, you're going to want to be able to defend any LADs that may come once, should COVID events push you beyond your overall completion date. Obviously photographs, emails, notices, like I touched on earlier. Definitely recording the dates when productivity has been affected. Dates, obviously, you may have left site, days you return to site, days when social distancing measures were reduced also. Those kinds of notices will give you a better chance of recovering any COVID costs. Allocation sheets, very important, and definitely a good exercise for any junior QSs, maybe to be on site, to be asking these questions, to see have our outputs been reduced as a result of the different ways of working, these restrictions. Have they had a real input? One of my early jobs as a junior QS was in fact allocation sheets. Sadly, I know too much about allocation sheets, but they're very good. That kind of record is very, will put you in a very strong position in relation to recovering costs and ensuring that basically you'll be put in the position you would be in if the contract had been performed as it should have, which is a very important rule to bear in mind here. Concrete pour sheets, again, I say that because a lot of my background is concrete frames, so the concrete pour records are actually very good to show what was poured on what dates. And again, it's just all stacking up. It's all building a picture to show that you were in fact affected by the events. And in this case, we're obviously talking about COVID events. Okay, so the final point here is proving the drop in outputs. I said that again, just to re-emphasize this point, is that the measured mile approach, these records are key. The measured mile approach is, measured mile is the productivity that you experienced before you started to become affected by COVID-19. Because so what you're saying is that had COVID-19 not occurred, then my outputs would have been X, and I would have and I wouldn't have incurred additional costs, and I would have finished by such a date. But what you're saying is that my pre-COVID outputs were X, but now my outputs following COVID and while I'm working to the restrictions due to COVID are Y, and you're obviously looking to pick up the difference between X and Y. So yeah, do bear in mind the measured mile approach. That would be my recommendation if you look at it on that basis. I mean, obviously it's more difficult, where you have site operations that had not begun before pre-COVID, which are obviously being carried out on site now. You got to look in. You've got to do more of an analysis. You probably have to go in and break down your contract rates. Hopefully, between ideally you might have a contract program or a program that was agreed that was not actually that didn't form part of the contract, but you actually included the start and finish dates anyway as a minimum, and you'd be able to do an analysis on that basis. But again, these analyses are fine, but you need the records to do them. And again, that list there, you want to be checking that. You want to be making sure the detail is there. And you just got to be vigilant on this stuff, guys, because, without the records, we won't get off the ground here. So again, keep the records up to scratch and make sure you're recording the right information. Okay, we'll move on to loss and expense. I don't want to spend that much time on loss and expense. I mean, first point here is I'm just saying is to avoid, global claims. The cause and effect here should be obvious. I mean, we get pushed into global claims where, it's very difficult to be able to demonstrate the, clear cause and effect. And, my advice would always be to try and steer clear, of global claims, where possible. And it should be possible here because, the events are fairly recent. So I just think if you go on a global basis, then you're putting yourself on the back foot. And I think it'll be very hard to understand what in fact the argument is and ultimately why you should be entitled to additional money for it. I put some prelim costs in here for the following, because I know that there has been a lot of additional PPE and welfare required on site. That's a case of, going back to this, if your contract has a schedule of attendances, then have another look at that to see what was to be provided by whom under your contract, because the welfare especially, that can be quite costly. Where subcontractors have had to maybe implement their own welfare separate to the main contractors, because it's an expense. That's not a cheap process. That's like mobilizing on site, and you obviously got to maintain that, etc. So do consider the schedule of attendances and who in fact was responsible to provide these items in the contract. Bear in mind also that you have a duty, like that most contracts say you have a duty to work in accordance with CDM regulations, and there is obligations there to say that you do have a duty to to ensure your workforce is safe, and part of that will drop down to the PPE and welfare obligation as well. So that's quite a difficult one. But as a starting point, I think just check that schedule of attendances. Travel costs. Now, I mean, I know a lot of people have been, especially here in London, that they've been avoiding public transport. But again, there's costs associated with that. I mean, if companies have to provide transport vans, or pick up, if they organize minibuses for staff as well, there's costs associated with that. Again, just check the schedule of attendances. Usually contracts are silent on such costs. I mean, I think that's a difficult one to prove. I mean, you want to be, like, as a responsible employer, you want to be making, you want to be doing as much as you can for your staff here, and I think that's right. So I think travel costs is one difficult one. It's constantly gets asked, but most contracts are silent, and I think it's a difficult one to to prove. You got to look after your workforce at the end of the day. Without them, these jobs don't happen. So yeah, I think you probably struggle on that one. My final point on loss and expense is that it picks up the residue of sums which are not recoverable elsewhere in the contract. So that's just to say, like, the loss and expense, and it's always worth bearing in mind, is that treat it as a last resort, because the residue means where your costs, or where you haven't been able to recover costs elsewhere in the contract. So I mean, this is after you take into account your your contract sum, your variations, your provisional sums. So it's there as as a last resort. And like I said earlier, I think if you can pull together the records to show the drop in productivity, and you can tag it onto clause 5.2, which is the imposition of restrictions, then I think you'll have a much better chance of recovering any additional costs, genuine additional costs due to COVID. Okay, so moving on. Now I just wanted to bring this case to your attention. I mean, this is, while we're on COVID, it's worth giving you talking about this one, because this was the case of Milchrist and Waters, and this is how the courts are treating companies who are saying that in this case they were saying they couldn't take part in an adjudication due to COVID. But we'll see what the what the court's answer was to that, and it's worth bearing in mind as to companies who may bring spurious cases, and that relates to, be it adjudication, or be it in relation to variations or loss and expense. And there's a underlying message here from the court as to how such spurious cases will be treated going forward. So the legal background here is, the question was, could a party be granted an injunction in an ongoing adjudication because of a belief that circumstances related to COVID-19 would result in a breach of natural justice? So the case background here was that Waters was a homeowner and Milchrist was a contractor. In September 17, Milchrist carried out works at the homeowner's property. In November 19, Milchrist ceased to trade. And in March 2020, Waters alleged overpayment of $45,000 and commenced adjudication. Now, an adjudicator was appointed and requested evidence by the 3rd of April. The adjudicator also requested a site visit on the 14th of April. Milchrist asked to postpone the adjudication outright due to COVID-19. But the adjudicator responded, and he proposed a 2-week extension to deal with COVID-19, and to deal with the, there's no getting away from the fact that there would be some delay. And what he was saying is that, I'll give you a 2-week extension, and that should be sufficient to deal with it. Anyway, Milchrist did not agree to the extension, and they basically challenged. They sought an injunction to prevent the adjudication from continuing, and the reasons why were that it was a breach of natural justice, as they had ceased trading. The second point was that they needed time to obtain evidence from witnesses. Then they said that their solicitor was self-isolating due to COVID-19. And finally, that it did not have time to instruct an alternative solicitor in order to attend that site inspection. Now, natural justice is a key point in adjudication because it is one of the few grounds available in order to resist enforcement. Should Part A proceedings or Part 7 or Part 8 proceedings be necessary. So that's the reason why natural justice. This is why it was basically fast tracked, and why it was important. The decision is really important. So the Technology and Construction Court refused the injunction on the basis that the contractor could have scanned documents to his solicitor. The court said there was no need for Milchrist to be present at the site visit, but could list the matters to be could be provided to the adjudicator in advance, and that was for the adjudicator to consider once he attended site. The contractor failed to contact its project manager, which was completely undermined its evidence point and the lack of availability of witnesses. It also had difficulty containing the previous director, and again, this was not due to COVID-19. That was due to some other circumstance. So you can see how Milchrist were trying to construe COVID-19. So the TCC confirmed that it would only grant an injunction to ongoing adjudication proceedings, very rarely and in very clear-cut cases, and satisfying the criteria for an injunction under the well-established principles in American Cyanamid versus Ethicon. Basically, there's a high threshold on getting an injunction. An injunction is an equitable remedy, very much at the discretion of the court. And what it's saying here is that Milchrist did not come, they didn't satisfy those requirements, and as such, refused the injunction. Now, the conclusion here is that COVID-19 delays are unlikely to amount to breach of natural justice at enforcement, but obviously this will be dependent on the facts. I mean, we can just deal with the case on its own merits here. Obviously, if there is some other specific set of facts and basically the delay is genuine, then that's not to say that an injunction wouldn't be considered on those grounds. They're just saying here it didn't stack up, and there was no injunction to be provided. In order to succeed, there must be clear causation without any other events breaking the chain of causation between the events unfolding and the ability to plead a party's case. The final point is that the parties must mitigate the effects of any causation. Parties should not rely on COVID-19 as a means to delay adjudication in order to gather more evidence. Because bear in mind, Milchrist were in fact the responding party. They may not have been expecting the adjudication, and basically the court felt that if you're looking to delay the proceedings in order to get your house in order and get your records together in order to be able to defend, then you can't rely on COVID-19 to do so. So there's a message from the court. They're saying that don't treat COVID-19 as a get out of jail card, and don't basically come to the court and look for sympathy where the facts show that that you're not entitled to it, because that was how the courts will treat it. You won't be successful. And it's just a reminder on the variation on the variation costs as well. I mean, don't pursue them if they're not genuine or you can't prove them, because again, you're not going to get much sympathy. And from experience, doing such things just causes frustration and upsets the relationship. If you're going, have the records, it's simple as that. Now this is just negotiation. So I mean, obviously, if you are negotiating COVID-19 costs, I mean, this is just some, if I'm just thinking, if I'm a QS on site, what would I do? So, I mean, the first thing I would be doing is I would be identifying the actual costs that have been incurred and that are linked to COVID-19. I would basically I'd be looking at my records to make sure that I could substantiate it. And I mean, I would be applying for them if they were genuine, and I'd be ensuring that they are in the application for payment. Now, one of the benefits of that is if you have got good records, you feel you have a strong case, you feel that it's clear that you have in fact been instructed, by your employer, then what you're saying, like, and they come back and say that that there is no entitlement. Well, there you have a crystallization of a dispute point. You know, should you think that you have such a strong case here that you may want to decide the point by adjudication. So, I mean, if they're not in the application for payment, then the dispute won't crystallize, and that would be another hurdle that you would need to overcome in adjudication. What I'm saying is that to avoid that, I would include them. But I must re-emphasize the point: they have to be genuine, and if they're not genuine, what I'm saying is that you shouldn't be going for them. And my second point here is that, you know, I'd use COVID-19 costs to negotiate a better deal, particularly if the project is at final account stage. I mean, you know, so what you're saying is that, you know, we have a strong case here on the COVID-19 costs, and you know, why not just try and negotiate a deal, you know, in relation and get costs there, because more than likely you're going to have had other areas where, you know, you may not be recovering your costs that, you know, that might be an issue. So, you know, consider wrapping it up as, you know, in a final account deal. That's what my approach would be if I was still a QS. Because I just think that it will deal with it. You'll be allowed to move on and keep projects moving. But do consider getting the costs into your application for payment again, just purely for that crystallization point. If they're not in, the dispute won't crystallize. Okay, so we're nearly there. Just a couple of points on any future contracts. So these are contracts that you may be signing up to since COVID, or even at the moment, because obviously now COVID-19 is a reasonably foreseeable as an event. I mean, it's here, you know, there's no doubting it's had an effect on everyone. And so it's just about how you actually, you know, agree the clauses that you may need to rely on at a future point. I mean, if you can do the analysis on contracts that have been affected by COVID, that will put you in an even better position to know the specific changes that need to be made in order to give you a higher rate of success on these future contracts. One point that's very common at the moment is where you broaden the definition of the force majeure clause to include time and/or money. I mean, because a lot of my time now is spent drafting force majeure, drafting COVID-19 related wording into the force majeure clause, and we do that under relevant events. We do it under relevant matters as well. Look, ultimately, it's a matter for discussion and negotiation between the parties, but definitely that's one element that must be considered at the moment. If you don't, you're taking a risk. You're relying on the position that COVID-19 is in fact the force majeure clause. It's risky stuff. So my advice there would be to broaden that definition to ensure it is included. You know, site possession, you know, typically the contractor is required to start work within, you know, 6 weeks of an instruction. Now I've seen those have been extended of late because, you know, we're still not out of the woods with COVID, so there's no guarantee as to, you know, and who's to say, you know, God forbid there might be a second spike and or a second wave, and then that could further delay projects. So, you know, I've seen that site possession, you know, people are starting to focus on that point because they just want to keep that window as long as possible, basically. Also the termination, you know, most clauses say that, you know, you can terminate if the project is suspended for a specific period of time. Again, that period is being extended as well. It's just something to bear in mind in your contracts now. You know, obviously you need to consider the potential effect on labour, plant, and materials. You know, it goes without saying, really. I mean, like all of those have been affected by COVID. So just as to how you allocate that risk under the contract is another point to be negotiated. A long stop date for future price increases, because, you know, again, business has been, you know, hugely affected by COVID. So who's to say that, you know, suppliers, you know, plant hire companies won't be increasing their, you know, their costs in the immediate future? Maybe so. that's something to bear in mind, so you may need to think about the the window for which your tender bid is open for acceptance, because you may need to rely on the position that if you don't, if you don't keep that pretty tight, then if you do enter into contract and there is future increases and you haven't taken them into consideration, well, that's another loss on your contract. So and you're going to have to deal with that. Not easy. So it's something else to bear in mind. And look, what I'm saying is that the contractor needs to address the issue. Like, I would encourage you not to stay silent on these things. I mean, we had a warning in Neodocs where the contractor is silent as to the contractor's method of working. I think it's fair. The onus is on the contractors here. I feel that they need to raise these points. They need to agree them. They need to, they need to be, engaging with these issues, because there's no point kicking the can down the road here, because all that's going to happen then is that you're going to have a spate of loss-making jobs at a later point, and we won't have anyone to blame but ourselves. So it's a very important issue. So don't be silent on it, and do engage with the detail. And final point is obviously to consider the drafting carefully, in order to avoid those future contract problems. So yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. That's the final points on the future contracts. So just to conclude, we looked at notices, we looked at variations in detail, a quick review on loss and expense. Obviously, we looked at adjudication, the position there with Milk Crystal and Waters, just some points for negotiation, and finally some issues in relation to future contracts. So look, I'm going to wrap it up there. I see there's a few questions, so I'm going to hand you back to Julie, and I'll take those now.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Conor. First question is, in terms of the valuation rules, where it says the execution of additional or substituted works, then a fair allowance must be made. Does this not only apply if it can be proved to be a relevant matter under JCT, and then this is how the loss of expense is valued?
Well, you see, the variation clause and the loss and expense are two different things. The relevant matters relates to loss and expense only, and doesn't affect the interpretation of the variation clause. So the variation clause, if you go back to it, it's saying that the imposition of restrictions, that variation clause wording does not link back to the relevant matters. The relevant matters just relate to loss and expense should you decide to go there.
Okay. Next question. Can you also use amounts paid under valuations before and during COVID-19 as a way to demonstrate the extent of impact of progress on site?
It's overly simplistic. It's too simplistic an approach to be able to show that the reduced outputs are related to COVID. You got to get more detail in order to be able to substantiate, because there's a whole host of reasons why your valuations may have reduced post-COVID to the ones that you were doing pre-COVID. So it's just too simplistic in its approach. You got to get into the detail, like I was saying earlier. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend pursuing such an approach.
Okay. Under an unamended JCT contract, no instruction has been issued by the employer. How can a variation be claimed due to a force majeure cause?
How can a variation be claimed? And no instruction has been issued by the employer. So this is where, yeah. So if you haven't been instructed, to work in a different manner by your employer, obviously the instruction is required in order to become entitled to the variation. So you got to look at the wording. I'd be surprised. Most there will have been communication from employers on most of the projects that I've seen to say that you know, obviously adhering to the social distancing guidelines, etc., because, you know, there is a responsibility there for the employer to ensure that is being adhered to. So you got to look at the interpretation of, you know, of that. I mean, has it been verbal? Has it been, you know, given in an email? You know, you got to look at a, you know, where, you know, has any form of correspondence been given? Does the employer know that you're in fact working, you know, in a different manner to the one you intended to under the contract? Now, but the force majeure clause, you know, the force majeure, again, that's not linked to the variation. The force majeure clause, you know, typically what we're seeing is that the force majeure relates to a relevant event, and a relevant event relates to an extension of time in order to defend, basically, in order to defend the. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. In order to defend LATs, sorry. So yeah, they're two separate points. The force majeure doesn't come in. You don't need to become entitled to the variation. You don't need to bring in the force majeure. You need to look into the imposition of restrictions. So yeah, be careful. Don't treat them all as their own discrete points, because, you know, getting tied up with, you know, those variation categories that I covered earlier, and then trying to pull in relevant events or relevant matters, they're all discrete points. So try not to get confused between them. A little plug is, if you want to more detail on those, is to go look at some of the other QS series webinars that I did cover those in detail. Sorry, it's a shameless plug, but
you're a brazen hussy, Mr. Ahern.
Well, look, yeah, check those, or I mean, just send me an email if you have more. If you are confused on the point, but just to reiterate, just treat them independently, because you just get confused otherwise. Okay.
Okay, they are all available on our YouTube channel in case. Someone here is asking, could it not be deemed unfair to the employer if the force majeure clause is amended in future contracts to be a relevant matter? It isn't only the contractor that loses out financially with a delay to the completion date.
Yeah, absolutely, it could be deemed unfair, but it's a negotiation, and then that's my point here, is that you know, the contractor and employer needs to engage together to, you know, the reality is that COVID is unlikely to be completely, you know, gone for some time. So the reality is that you've got to deal with it on its merits in each contract, and the allocation of risk is all agreed under the contract. I mean, sure, it could be unfair to the employer, but then, you know, conversely, it could be unfair to the contractor if he's not entitled to, you know, to an extension of time or money or additional money, basically lost in expense due to you know, COVID. So again, these are all points that need to be negotiated. I mean, these are commercial contracts. These are negotiations. You know, the allocation of risk is basically whatever gets agreed between the parties. And, you know, basically anything can be agreed in these contracts. So, you know, don't rely on the position that it's going to be unfair on either one. What I'm saying is that you need to engage and actually come to a clearly worded agreement as to the allocation of risk. To not have that is just leaving the door open for problems later on down the line.
Okay. Where fluctuation option applies, how would this work for COVID-19 claims, assuming fluctuation option will apply in this circumstance?
So fluctuation options, I mean, again, depends on, I mean, I'm surprised, you would have fluctuation options in an unamended JCT. I mean, we see them very rarely, because, you know, when we do schedules of amendments, and most of the schedules of amendments that we see just strikes through them. But how would this work for COVID-19 claims? Look, I mean, usually fluctuation clauses are clearly written so that it's quite clear in the wording. I mean, typically you would need to show that prices have changed. I mean, but how you would tie that back to COVID-19 claims is that, I'd imagine, won't be straightforward, because nobody's going to say to you, you know, due to COVID-19, we're going to put our prices up. I mean, it can be inferred from the fact that they are putting their prices up. But no, I don't imagine that suppliers or plant hire companies are going to say, yeah, well, our rates are going up now. I mean, if because obviously, if that does happen, then you're going to have to interpret that as there's going to be some link with COVID-19. So I just say, read clauses. But again, that will only apply in the event that increases have been realized. You're not going to bring a fluctuations evaluation if there has not been any genuine fluctuations. So again, just go back, read the clauses, check the wording, and just see where, just analyze the costs that have increased, and if they're genuine, go for them. I can deal with that. I mean, if you need more information, just send me an email, but that'd be my initial advice. Okay.
Yeah. Someone here is asking, would you suggest looking at the force majeure wording for a minor works contract that they're looking to go into from August?
Which one is, would you? So could you repeat that one, Julie?
Sorry, someone's asking, would you suggest looking at the force majeure wording for a minor works contract that they're looking to go into from August?
Yeah, I would, yeah. I would. I mean, it doesn't need to be, I mean, force majeure has been, the force majeure has been interpreted and, commonly interpreted as, an event that occurs that is beyond the reasonable control of either of the parties. So that is, I mean, I don't know any employer and contractor that could possibly be responsible for COVID-19 events that have occurred here in the UK. So there you go. There it is, an event outside of the control of either of them. Yeah, definitely. In a minor works contract, I think, the onus, for a contractor to go into a minor works contract and not to deal with the point, you're proceeding at risk. And again, you're potentially kicking the can down the road, and you're going to be looking at a potential, lack of an extension of time, which is you're going to get hit with LADs. I mean, if you were a contractor and you were facing into that prospect, I don't see why you wouldn't engage on it, because it's very important. I mean, it mightn't be an issue today, but it's definitely going to be an issue in time under that contract. So regardless of the contract, I think you need to be, I think you need to be agreeing the point and the allocation of risk under force majeure and events associated with COVID.
Okay. Someone else says that you spent a lot of time on recovery of costs. If no instruction has been issued, do the points on recovery of cost have relevance?
Again, yeah, I mean, I had spent a lot of time on that, because that's the, that would be the way to prove that, that you have in fact incurred additional costs due to COVID. I mean, how the communication has been. I mean, the interpretation of the instruction and basically the change in working method. That's all going to depend on the facts in each case under each separate contract here. So I mean, but there's no doubt that you need the two. Because if you haven't been given an instruction, then what, have you in fact been working in a different manner? If you haven't been told to do anything differently, then, and you haven't worked any differently, then you shouldn't have any concerns due to COVID-19 costs. That, I mean, we'll come, that's the point we'll keep coming back to. It is the instruction, it is the restrictions, and it is the costs associated with that. I mean, when we say fair allowance, and if you go back to Henry Boot and Alston, we're saying, that fair allowance is recovery of costs, but also a fair allowance for your overheads and profit as well.
Okay. Someone also said you've made no mention of mediation. Is this a welcome alternative to adjudication or court?
Yeah, media. I mean, I'm focusing on COVID-19 and costs. I mean, we all know the benefits of mediation, and certainly is, and even most contracts say that you should try mediation, as an alternative. And I'd absolutely be, agree with that. Mediation is a very effective way of resolving disputes, and absolutely it is a welcome alternative to adjudication or court.
Okay. In terms of the valuation rules, where it says the execution of additional or substituted works, then a fair allowance must be made. Therefore, am I correct? Therefore, I'm correct in saying the contractor will not be able to make a claim unless there has been additional or substituted works instructed.
It says the execution of additional. Yeah, I mean, this was what I called category 1 variations. It was that, I mean, it was the additional omitted additional or substituted works. I mean, the warning I was giving there, I mean, that's not going to be the most popular clause to category to follow for a variation. But the that case, the Strachan case was saying that you got to look at what in fact the definition of the works means. If you look at the second category, that's where the fair allowance comes in, because what it's saying is that if there has been a change in the conditions that has been imposed upon you, then you're entitled to the fair allowance. If you go back and read the variation clause, that's where the fair allowance wording will come in, and the fair allowance is to deal with the change in conditions, and the change of conditions is the difference between how you were working pre-COVID against how you've been working post-COVID. The fair allowance is to pick up the difference there, and that will require some form of analysis of your bill of quantity of your BOQ rates as a starting point, because you're still carrying out the same contract works, you're just carrying them out in different conditions, and the fair allowance is just to reimburse you for the change of conditions.
Okay.
So just go back and look at the two separate variation clauses again, because the points there are in fact two separate clauses. I mean, the additional or substituted works is generally clause 5.1, and the fair allowance comes in at clause 5.2, typically under JCT contract.
Okay, is there any way that contractors would be able to use change by statutory authority relevant event to claim monies from the client? For example, the government guidance at the beginning was unclear and open to interpretation.
Yeah, this is this is unclear because the government guidance is just that. I mean, it wasn't I mean, statutory authority we generally take to mean legislation. Now, we know that the Coronavirus Act 2020 was implemented obviously to deal with COVID-19, but that doesn't relate to how the changes that should be made on construction sites. I mean, that related to I suppose issues around NHS and basically protecting the wider society rather than anything specific to a construction project. So I think you'll struggle with that one, unless, I mean, because the CLCs, the site operating procedures, again, they were guidance. They weren't a change in statutory authority as such. So it's open to interpretation, but from what I've seen, I don't think it's going to be successful trying to recover the time and money under such a clause.
Okay. And final question for today. In what situation should the contractor agree to time and money for additional work under a variation clause instead of under a loss of expense claim?
For additional work. Okay, I'll take those in turn. So time, if you carry out a variation, most variations are relevant events under your standard JCT clause. So treat that separately, and that's basically where the client is obviously impose a variation on you that is on the critical path, and as a result extends you beyond your overall completion date agreed under the contract. So I would treat that separately. I mean, the money under the variation and loss and expense, money under a variation, that's basically, I mean, again, this is why I'm saying is to reread the clauses for your variation clauses, because I mean, if it's additional work that is being carried out under the same conditions and is of a similar nature and a similar character to the work that you've priced in your bill of quantities, then that's a variation, and as such, you'd be entitled to be reimbursed under the BOQ rate that's been included in your contract. Now, again, if you're carrying out contract works, then like I was saying, there's been restrictions or additional conditions imposed. Then you get the fair allowance, for that change. I mean, the loss and expense type, comes in basically. That's where, the typical catch-all loss and expense relevant matter, because you need, in order to become entitled to loss and expense, you need to cite a relevant matter. And basically, that's like I was saying earlier, that's the residue. So that's basically any costs that have not been recovered elsewhere under contract. But that's once you've gone through the process of obviously assessing your bill of quantities, assessing your variations, provisional sums, and basically it's what's left at the end. So loss and expense, additional prelims associated with a variation because the contract has been extended. That prolongation, that should be recovered as a loss and expense item. And again, the loss that can be recovered under the instructions are included as a relevant matter. But just take, for example, if you've been delayed by your employer and they've imposed an impediment, prevention, or default upon you, that's a classic ground. That's like the catch-all ground for a loss and expense type item. And again, you'll be entitled to to recovery of loss and expense under those grounds. What I'm saying, what I'm saying is that if you can't, my approach has been go for the variations first, because that's what the contract requires you to do. And basically where you can't recover anything under the variation clause, which has not been picked up anywhere else under the contract, then go for your loss and expense there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Conor. That was a fair few questions that you covered today. And as always, if you've got anything specific that you'd like to speak to Conor about on any of the topic that he's covered today, his email address is conorahern@silverllp.com. Is on the website. It's also on your copy of the notes, which are available for download. Other than that, we wish you a happy working week. Those of you that are joining us at 5, we'll see you, or 6 rather, we'll see you again then. Otherwise, we'll hopefully see you again very soon, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you, Conor.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.